and welcome to the Great International Education and Schools Fair. Today we're going to be talking about transition care in international schools with some brand new research findings from Jane Barron and Ellen Mahoney. And here we have with us Marianne Curphey, journalist, who's going to follow up and interview Jane Barron, who's with us here today. But first, we are going to have a look at a presentation that Ellen and Jane made about their research findings.
Welcome, everybody. We are so excited to have you here. This is our presentation that is highlighting the key findings and recommendations from our latest independent research paper called Surveying the Landscape: Common Practices, Challenges, and Opportunities in International Transitions Care, School Care. This is the latest report card on international school transitions care, and it's our hope that school leaders will gain insight into the common practices, challenges, and opportunities faced by the international school community and be able to use this to evaluate their own understanding and that of their colleagues and their own educational institution. So we hope that it will assist you in providing optimal transitions care for your entire school community.
Yes, we do. So let's introduce ourselves, Ellen. My name is Jane Barron. I am an author, researcher, and education consultant specializing in student and family cross-cultural transitions. As founder of Globally Grounded, I consult to international and local schools, both day and boarding, along with students and their families, helping just developing their understanding of the impact of moving between and among cultures, evaluating and creating programs, and implementing support mechanisms around transition and cultural integration that enhance learning and life. I've served on the leadership team and board of the not-for-profit organisation Safe Passage Across Networks, or SPAN, since 2016, and I'm currently serving as the Director of Training and Consultancy. My work is informed by 27 years experience in education, including both international and local schools in a variety of roles, from classroom teacher through to board member. I've also parented 2 cross-cultural kids as we lived, worked and studied in Southeast Asia, and enjoyed a domestically mobile childhood that included 7 different school moves as a day and a boarding student, and then a repatriation back to Australia. I'm currently based in Sydney with my family, including a class of 2020 child who just graduated last week.
Yay! And my name is Ellen Mahoney. I'm the CEO of Sea Change Mentoring, which is an organization that works solely with international schools. And it helps schools develop or further strengthen the teacher-student relationships within the school community. It helps them develop their social emotional learning programs and provides transition support. I'm also the CEO and co-founder of the Circulus Institute, which was launched just at the end of the summer of 2020. And that is a training institute for educators in the international school system, but also any other school system around the world. And it is solely focused on developing the stress management, resilience skills, and the social and emotional competencies that are required of educators to thrive. I also have served as a co-founding board member for Safe Passage Across Networks alongside Jane. Also a former board member of Families in Global Transition. So all this transitions work is really important to me. Prior to all of this work, I have been very involved in the youth mentoring field in the United States and certified in mentoring supervision by Fordham University's Graduate School of Social Work. And personally, just like Jane, I also moved around a lot. I grew up in the United States, in Japan, and in Singapore, repatriating twice before I was 18. So this work, like Jane, is really, it's important to me professionally and personally.
Yes. So since 2018, actually, Ellen and I have been on a mission to really understand what's currently being done in international schools to address cross-cultural transitions care, the reason why some transitions efforts never get off the ground and others do. As we present our findings and recommendations to you today, we'd really like you to keep these 3 questions at the forefront of your mind. what is being done in international schools across the globe to address cross-cultural transitions care? How does your school compare with international school transition care programs across the globe? And thirdly, given that the impact of cross-cultural transitions on wellbeing and learning remains a serious concern in the international school community, how can you lead your school towards optimal transition care for your students, your parents, and your staff?
So we took our curiosity to schools around the world, and we surveyed international schools that were enrolling a percentage of foreign students, whether it was a large foreign student population or a small foreign student population. And the aim was to ultimately equip school leaders with a logical pathway towards effective transition support, not only for their students, but for the students' parents and for their faculty.
Yes. So our key findings centred around 6 main areas, and here they are here: the transition care programs, level of understanding of cross-cultural transition care issues among school leadership, cross-cultural transitions care as a school-wide priority, provision of curricular and non-curricular opportunities addressing transition care, differentiation of transition care needs across the school community, and assessment of transition care programs. And whilst our report covers each of these in much greater detail, we'd just like to highlight a few of them in our time together today.
I think one of the findings that was fairly shocking or surprising for both Jane and myself is this finding here, that of the schools we surveyed, only half of the international schools, or a little over half, about 54% of the schools we surveyed, said they had a transitions care program at all. And for those that did, only 6% said that that program was flourishing.
So there's plenty of room for improvement, isn't there?
Yeah.
Another interesting finding for us was around the differentiation of transitions care. Within an international school community, there are many different types of transition, and many different populations experience transition at different times. So our research found that students, parents, and staff arrivals are generally prioritised by many international schools. But interestingly, fewer than half of our participants support those leaving during the academic year or at graduation. And even more so, only a very small percentage of international schools provided any transition care support for students who are returning home, the stayers, or the locals. And interestingly, the stayers and the locals are the linchpins of most international schools, as the arrivers are arriving and the leavers are leaving.
So the other interesting finding that this research uncovered is that the majority of international schools really don't have a formal way of assessing their transitions care program, if they have one. So they might feel that the program is successful or not successful, but they don't have any data to support it. Of the schools that have alumni programs, when we dug a little deeper and asked them whether or not they use their alumni as a resource to gain greater understanding, very few did.
Yes, so it's a great resource right at their fingertips, isn't it?
Yeah.
So our research is important because it draws on the foundational work of many researchers who have gone before us. And here are just a few of them: Dr. Barbara Shatey, Mary Langford, Dr. Robert Rich, Dr. Ruth Van Rieken, Drs. Doug Ota, and the Council of International School International Accreditation Standards from 2018. And it just confirms that this research has been circulating since the 1990s, yet it really is not widely well known or embedded into the international school transition care landscape, even in 2020. And so it's really for this reason that it was a priority for Ellen and I to get our research into the hands of school leaders rather than being catalogued and left on the library shelves to gather dust.
True. So, our report is as Jane said, it's not just the dry data, but it's also there are practical recommendations and priorities that we're sharing with you. And so, in this presentation right now, we'll just share a few of them, but our report highlights more. So, one of the first opportunities and recommendations we wanted to share with you is that you should be developing a transitions care program if you don't already have one, and you should continue to work on strengthening it. What does that look like? Well, developing a transitions team can considerably improve a transitions care culture in a school community. When you think about all of the equity work lately that was sort of driven by the murder of George Floyd in the United States and the subsequent reaction by international school alumni. I think when you're thinking about the transitions care team, you want to make sure that that team is representative of the community you're serving. So, whether that means that they're representative of the same cultures, of the population's experiences, it's important that that team kind of, represents the larger community. Beyond thinking about a supportive transitions team, it's critical to have leadership on board. So leadership support is absolutely central to the success of a comprehensive transitions care program. And then schools just need to differentiate their transitions care programs across the various transitions phases, the entering, the leaving, the staying, et cetera, and also differentiate across the various population groups.
Yes. Another opportunity that lies ahead for international schools is about building transitions care into the school culture. Because the thing is that board members and heads of schools are the custodians of the school's mission and the school's values. And so they really do have a responsibility to re-evaluate the importance of developing a transition culture within their community. And we would suggest beginning with the mission statement and looking for ways to embed the associated transition care vocabulary at every possible opportunity and level, both curriculum and non-curriculum opportunities.
This next recommendation is something that Jade and I have been talking about for years, which is a recommendation to use your alumni programs and other evaluative measures to assess the success of your program. It's absolutely critical to understand what works, what doesn't work, and it will, of course, save you time and resources when you put those measures in place. Don't forget that you want to evaluate the experiences of not just your students, but also your parents and your faculty. And really utilize those alumni. It's a great way to keep them engaged, and they're just a tremendous resource to help you gain a deeper insight into the experiences of coming in and out of your school community.
Yes, definitely. So the findings of our research really do come at a critical juncture in international education. Thanks to the research of others, often conducted by adult third culture kids and participated in by adult third culture kids, and local students at international schools, we are actually the most informed generation about the impact of unmanaged mobility. However, as we mentioned earlier, this research appears not to have really found its way into international schools. So now, in a position to use those alumni students and those third culture kids' stumbling blocks as stepping stones, international schools are really poised to transform the international and transition care education landscape, the learning and the lives of cross-cultural students, families, and your staff as well.
Yeah, and so it's very interesting to publish this research right now with COVID-19 just upending and creating so many changes in our lives as educators and as human beings. But beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, there's some other really interesting things that are happening that are kind of connecting to this work. So if you think about the growing popularity of the social and emotional learning movement, where we're thinking about the whole experience of a child and the relationships that children have that are so important for their learning and development. When you think about how we are thinking about this idea of global citizenship and whether or not we're being authentic about that idea. When you think about the discussions that we're having right now on who is represented in our schools and how are they treated based on their backgrounds, when you think about the growing research on well-being and stress and depression and anxiety across the world, and then you think about COVID-19, where I think so many of us are grieving. So many of us did not experience closure. We may have had to leave our schools suddenly, or not really get to say a proper goodbye to our students or to our colleagues, or start in a new school when we didn't know anyone, whether we are students, teachers, or parents. We're all going through quite a bit of transitions. So I think this work is really interesting to get out there right now, as I believe that a lot of these themes are on our minds. And it's a reminder of why this kind of transitions care support is critical.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I just feel that if we in the international school community and local school community for that matter can really embed and support and empower our students, our parents and our staff to manage their mobility and to put the transition care practices that they learn and their understandings into place, it will just place them in such a strong position in any of their transitions in life, including managing COVID-19.
Yeah, absolutely. So go ahead. Sorry, Jane.
No, that's okay. So we would like to leave you with some wise words from Doug Otter, words that have greatly impacted Ellen and I in who we are and the work that we do. True international educator, or the true international educator, does more than just an outstanding job in the classroom. The true international educator models how to cope with the human challenges of living at the confluence points of grief and culture, the junctures of connections and losses, so his or her students can also learn how to deal with what we could actually refer to as the hidden curriculum of the global age.
Amazing that he wrote that in 2014. It's so relevant right now in 2020. So yeah, I'm glad you shared that quote. So if you want to find out more, there's multiple ways that you can get involved. You can access the entire 2020 report. You can join an online conversation on November 24th or 25th, depending on your time zone, where Jane and I will be discussing the data and inviting people to discuss the data with us. And also, if you're looking for further support, it's available to you. Jane does an excellent job with her working Globally Grounded to support schools in managing these transitions. I do some similar work as well at Sea Change Mentoring. You see our email addresses right there. So please reach out to us that way if you want more support, or you can visit our websites. The report is available on seachangementoring.com, and it's free. So we want as many people as possible to read it and to learn from it and to move forward, in care and compassion for your communities.
So thank you for that wonderful presentation, Ellen and Jane. Because Ellen is obviously in the US and you're in Australia, in Sydney, the next part of this session will be conducted with Marianne Curphey and myself. So over to you, Marianne.
So Jane, thank you so much for that absolutely fascinating research and for the video, which is really interesting. What really struck me was the expression that you used at the end in the quote from Dr. Douglas Otter about the hidden curriculum. And I wondered, how did you become involved in transition care in international schools, and why do you think it's so important?
Yes. Well, that's a really good question, Marianne. Thank you for asking. I was teaching at an international school in Southeast Asia, and I had my gorgeous little grade 4 class. So that's 9 and 10-year-olds. And a few of them in my class had blockages in their learning, and I knew it wasn't cognitive. I knew it wasn't behavioral, but I just couldn't put my finger on what was behind these blockages in learning. And as I came alongside these students to understand their story, I realized that there was a common denominator, and the common denominator was mobility. So I started asking my international school colleagues who had been in international schooling a lot longer than I had, were they familiar with this phenomenon of mobility impacting learning? And they all looked at me very blankly and said no. And I just had this hunch. So I went in search of research. And when I'd done my master's degree in the years prior, I'd read some of Barbara Shatey's work on transition care and the importance of transition care. And so I contacted her and I said, which schools are doing this well? And is there a connection between mobility and learning? And so she put me in contact with Doug Otter, who had just finished writing his book at the time, as a matter of fact. And so I learnt there that there was basically one piece of research that said that mobility impacted learning. So what began as conversations with my colleagues and parents quickly turned to, you need to educate us about this. We don't know about this. So I began facilitating workshops and family mentoring sessions on transition care. And honestly, almost before I knew it, Globally Grounded was born. And so that's how it all began.
That's an amazing story. And what's particularly interesting about that is how it was showing up so early in those children. So
yes.
The mobility was starting to have an impact at a very young age, whereas perhaps we might think it would show up, say, in teenagers when they had stronger friendships and they were struggling to move on or make new friendships. But it's interesting that you spotted that so early. So what was the catalyst for the research project that we've just seen that you've done with Ellen?
Oh, great question. So as Ellen mentioned just now, she and I served together as founding board members of Safe Passage Across Network, or SPAN. And in those early days, we were trying to build the organisation as a home for transition care providers. Plus, we were also developing our own consulting companies at the same time. And it became clear that we were flying blind. Information about what was actually happening on the ground in schools to address cross-cultural transition care was really hard to come by. And we wanted to understand what was actually being done, what was hindering schools from developing transition care programs, and how we could better support international schools to provide that optimal transition care that Ellen and I spoke about for their school communities. So as you heard just now, Ellen and I are both passionate about transition care, and that comes from lived experience and expertise. And to be honest, we both have a tendency to jump in boots and all when we believe in something. And in this case, we jumped into research, much of which we already knew, but we found ourselves immersed in fascinating work that had been in circulation since the 1990s. And this research became the foundation for our research because we wanted to understand how all this knowledge was being used to address transition care in schools right now.
And what was really fascinating about what we just heard was how half of the schools had transition care, but the other half didn't at all. And of those that did, only 6% felt that was flourishing. That's a really low number, isn't it? Really low.
It is really low number, yes, because of course what that means is that 46% of international schools don't have a transition care program. And this was something that was really concerning to us. These schools without programs really do need to be equipped to develop their transition care policies and practices. And given that only 6%, as you just said now, Marianne, of those do regard their programs as flourishing, the majority of schools really need more support to strengthen them. And part of this includes schools really understanding the barriers of developing best practice transition care programs and increasing awareness and understanding of the importance of transition care among leadership and key stakeholders in international school. Our research really does go into a lot more detail on this.
And you also made a really interesting point that it's about the children who are leaving and arriving, but it's also about those who are already there. and who stay there when their friends move on. And to me, that's perhaps the section of the community that might be left out or not included. So it's interesting that you include those. You also talk about parents and teachers and how they too would have a role. So you shared these findings with us. What are some of the implications for international schools in terms of their transition care programs?
Yes, so that's what I was just talking about just now around that that whole area about the importance of equipping schools to really develop their transition programs and to really understand those barriers that I mentioned before. Two of those barriers that stood out in our research were around time. And let's be honest, every school has that challenge. As an educator myself, I do completely understand that. But another one was around the perceived lack of need or awareness of the importance of transition care and addressing transitions and mobility for students, which we found quite surprising. And that was also amongst leadership. And so schools really do need to understand those barriers. And as I said, we do go into more detail around that in our report. We don't have time to do all of that today, unfortunately.
That's fascinating. You also talk about the different transition needs cares of different sections of the school community. Can you just give us a little bit more of a flavour of that?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, when I saw our data on the various populations and transition phases, I actually thought that there must have been an error in our data, but sadly there wasn't. As far back as 2008, Robert Rish's research had reported that the arrivals piece was prioritised in most international schools, which is great to know. But the other transition phases were given less or no support. And our research, unfortunately, found that remains the case in 2020. And when it comes to the stayers and the locals in an international school community, support for them is vital to the emotional health of the individuals, but also to the school, because although they may not technically be the ones moving, the world around them most certainly is. So they need to be equipped to say clear goodbyes so that they can say clear hellos. Doug Otis says that this is actually the first law of transition, and it absolutely applies to stayers because they are the stabilisers in an international school, where the arrivers and the leavers come and go. And speaking of leavers, which you just mentioned before, Marianne, there are many different types of leavers, and each one really does have specific needs. An individual, whether it's a student, a parent, or a staff member moving to a new location, has very different transition needs to someone who's returning home, especially given that repatriation is regarded as the hardest of all international moves, something that I can attest to for sure. The student leaving for tertiary studies, and actually their parents for that matter, have specific transition needs too. So international schools really should differentiate their transition care for the population and the transition phase if they want to truly meet the transition needs of their school community.
That's an absolutely brilliant point, and perhaps one that we hadn't thought about before is that there are those different needs for different stages of school. They might be leaving in the middle of the academic year. They might be happy to be leaving after they're in year 12 and they're moving on to university or tertiary education. So yes, I can see that that's really interesting, the way that you need to think specifically, almost a kind of bespoke service for each one. Yes. What about those that do move on? How do you assess how successful the transition care has been for them? And also, how do you keep track of the alumni and talk to them about what worked for them and what didn't?
Yes, well, this was a real surprise to us, as Ellen mentioned just now. And, given that schools by their very nature are in the business of learning outcomes and assessing for mastery, we were quite shocked to realise that the vast majority of schools have no formal way of assessing whether their transition care program is actually working. And we really do see this as a hindrance to providing that optimal transition care that we keep referring to. After all, assessment helps define goals for success and then allows for feedback for participants on whether those goals are actually being met. So without assessment, it's really difficult to know whether a transition program is truly supporting the students, the parents and the staff in effective ways. You know, it's kind of in the same way that our research has now informed how we can better support schools towards this optimal transition care. Schools themselves really need to assess their transition programs to inform their policies and also their practice. And as you just mentioned, Marianne, the most obvious way to begin this, in our opinion, is to tap into that school alumni. And it's not that hard to do within the admissions team. They all have contact details, and developing a robust online group is a great way to start that connection with alumni, and also providing opportunities for them to give back to the school as well, in whether it's in careers nights, coming online virtually and talking about careers and so on. There's great connection points to network there with the alumni. But understanding their transition experiences really places schools in a stronger position to learn and then to adapt their program to meet the transition needs of all their community members. So we would really encourage schools to develop an alumni program and then tap into it as a great resource.
So in terms of transition care, obviously some of the schools are on board, half of the ones that you looked at have got some sort of program. For those that haven't, what do you think is the absolute bottom line why transition care is so important and why it does need to be knit into the school culture from the very beginning?
Yeah, great question. In fact, we spent a whole hour discussing this topic during our panel last Thursday, didn't we, Fiona? And for those people who are watching, if you missed it, be sure to catch the recording on the Relocate Global website. But in brief, transitioning from one grade to another, one school to another, from one location to another, one culture to another, even in my experience, from home to boarding school, it does have a lasting impact on us. In fact, all transitions in life, whether it's marriage, divorce, birth of a child, moving out of home, starting a new job, retirement, they all have lasting impacts on us. And that's because transitions impact our emotions. We know, perhaps in 2020 more than ever before, that our emotions really do underpin our ability to learn and to think. In fact, my favourite researcher on this topic is Dr. Mary Helen Imordino-Yang. And she says that emotions are not just messy toddlers in a china shop running around breaking and obscuring delicate cognitive glassware. Instead, emotions are more like the shelves underlying the glassware. Without them, cognition, learning and thinking, has less support. And I suspect that this may go some way to explaining why Professor John Hattie, in his 2009 research on visible learning, found that mobility was the single most detrimental factor to learning. And you know what? Since then, he has gone through that research again 3 more times, and mobility remains still one of the most detrimental factors to learning. So in answer to your question, Marianne, by providing transition care to students and also to parents and staff, we equip each individual to navigate the triumphs and trials of transition so that rather than it inhibiting, it actually activates and enhances learning, relationships and life.
That's brilliant. That's very positive. So if a school or an educator or a parent has got hold of your report, what can they do with it? Or how can they take this forward?
Yes, well, I would say the first thing to do is to use it as an evaluative tool. The information in our report really does provide schools with insight into the common practices, challenges and opportunities faced by their international school community, and it will help them improve the way they care for young people impacted by mobility, but also their parents and the staff who educate them. So from here, schools can begin to develop a strategic plan for optimal transition care and then decide on just 1 or 2 initiatives to address the specific transition care needs of each population group and or each transition phase. And I'm a big believer in solutions-based learning and solution-based strategies. So I would encourage schools to look at what works well within their school and their transition care, and then build on that. And of course, Ellen and I are always available to assist schools and individuals through this process in a comprehensive and collaborative manner, from that evaluation and program design through to implementation and then review.
And Fiona, you come from it from an employer's perspective, don't you? In the sense that a family that transitions well and comes into the new culture and the new school and fits in and is comfortable is really important, both in terms of the family unit and the children and how the parents cope. Is there more that employers could do to ease this transition and to support families as they move around the globe?
Yes, I think there is, absolutely. And I think this report that Ellen and Jane have produced offers some fabulous insights that can be borrowed from, that must surely apply to the adults as well, not only the parents, but all those employed in an international context. And what you were saying about repatriation, that's been one of the hobby horses about how well do companies support repatriation, not only for the employee, but also for the family and the partner and the children resettling. But there's other points as well. There's been much more emphasis on employee engagement, and that has become very important because of supporting talent. So in the context of international organisations, understanding that a high percentage of your employees may indeed be third culture kids, that they are moving or repatriating with a family of their own, which are third culture kids. And then if they're leaving an assignment somewhere in the world and perhaps going back home, what do those people feel in that project team? And also the parent community and the wives and husbands and partners also with them. So there's a lot there that is highly relevant. And all these changes to policy, things like localization as well, when families have made a decision, and also employers as well, that the best solution is for a family to be long-term in a country. So how well is that transition coped with? There's a lot there as well, and also for the team within the organisation, that this person that came from another country is there now permanently as part of the local team. So lots to take home. Also, the relocation professionals, as we know, is a wide support system which can range from tax to immigration professionals to HR global mobility professionals, plus destination service providers or relocation consultants, as you may know them, who are the sort of hands-on people who are guiding a family through the change, finding a school, finding a home. But also they are people in the link of helping to say the goodbyes. So I think also this idea of employees saying goodbye and the partner and the family is really important. And also a final plug for international schools and all schools really, the great work they do in doing this, saying hello and saying goodbye. And if more employers could appreciate the importance of this, I'm sure that repatriation and moving on to the next assignment would be a smoother process and is good business for the organisation.
I agree with everything that you have said there, Fiona, and in my work when I'm mentoring families that are either relocating or repatriating, what I find is that we really have to help the adults, as you were mentioning before, to put their own oxygen mask on first before they can really help the rest of the members of their family through the challenges associated with transition. And so if organisations can really support the employer and the other adults within a family to really understand the process of transition and give them tools and strategies, as we've talked about, then firstly, as you mentioned, they will be much more effective as employees, but then the rest of their family will have a much smoother and more positive transition, which takes a lot of stress out of the employee, and they're able to do their job so much better. So it's actually a win-win.
And Fiona, there's a lot of resources coming up this week, aren't there, for families and educators and parents to help guide them through the process of relocation, choosing a school, supporting them in the country that they might be moving to. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, well, as we've got, there's also a lot of content actually on the website, relocateglobal.com, which has got the education and school section, but we have a special great international education and schools fair section, which has got lots of wonderful articles and material. But coming up very shortly and next week, we've got some more webinars, and this includes the Bridge School, which is offering full online education, so that's on Monday. Then we've got The Making of Us, Why School Matters, and the Single Sex or Co-ed Debate, and that's with Clarissa Farr, an international education expert and who was a former High Mistress of St Paul's Girls' School. So that's going to be a fascinating discussion. And then Educating Global Citizens, so the challenges and the opportunities of raising children in an international environment. So parents and employers and relocation professionals, here's a really good opportunity to hear what experts in schools, admissions officers and people have to say. And then we're doing a similar sort of context on the Middle East and in Europe on the afternoon on Thursday the 19th. And then, as you kindly mentioned, Jane, we've got a wonderful showcase of a school that is flourishing and actually lives and breathes transition care, and that is Crossroads, where the International School of London are showcasing their transition programme, which includes all the wonderful work they do with native languages, as well as settling not only the children, but the whole family. So
yeah. They're an inspiration. Yeah, ISL are an inspiration. They're doing some amazing work in transition care.
Yes, so that is the end of our session for today. We'd like to thank everyone so much for joining us, for you joining us today, Jane, and thanks to Ellen again for joining us earlier on, and for Marianne, our journalist, who has really teased out some excellent things for us to think about. So here's just a few of the slides for you to watch and the contact details for Jane and Ellen and how to get hold of the wonderful research. So thank you very much, and please do join us for the rest of the Education and Schools Fair running throughout November and also available on the website. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.